My name is Sophia Knight. I am 38 years old, a commander in the United States Navy. 30 seconds ago, I was standing at the security checkpoint of the West Wing of the White House. The heavy wool of my dress uniform pressed tight against my shoulders. The static of Secret Service radios cracked in the freezing Washington wind. Standing right next to me was my biological father. He smoothed out a wrinkle on a borrowed suit jacket, clutching a VIP invitation card in his thick hand. When the security officer asked for identification, my father turned to me. He looked me up and down, then smirked. That same cruel, half-sided grin that haunted my entire childhood. He lowered his voice, sinking a blade hidden in the guise of family, right into my ribs. "Step aside, you are not invited." My heart rate did not change. I looked straight into his eyes and pulled out my phone. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen, right until a 4-star Navy admiral walked past him like he did not even exist. Tell me where you are listening from, hit the like button, and subscribe if you have ever been stripped of your right to exist by your own family just because you were not their golden child. His sarcastic words dropped onto the cold granite floor. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I just held my phone screen flat against the Secret Service optical scanner. A sharp mechanical beep cut through the freezing air. It was a harsh, unforgiving sound. The security console light snapped from a hard red to a blinding green. The monitor flashed bold crimson letters, Commander Sophia Knight, Primary Principal. The female Secret Service agent sitting behind the 2-inch thick bulletproof glass jerked upright. Her spine locked into a rigid line. She completely ignored the flimsy piece of paper my father was waving around. Instead, she pressed 2 fingers to her earpiece, her voice dropping an octave strictly professional. "Condition level 1, she is here." My father frowned. The VIP pass in his hand trembled just a fraction. I could hear his heavy breathing, smelling the stale coffee and cheap aftershave on him. He cleared his throat, a low guttural sound of blue-collar entitlement. He took a heavy step forward, trying to use his broad shoulders to block me out. He wanted to demand his rights. He wanted to claim his spot at the front of the line like he always did back home. He never got the chance to open his mouth. The heavy blast-proof doors from the inner lobby swung wide open. Admiral James Vance took massive strides straight toward the security perimeter. The brass buttons on his overcoat caught the overhead lights. My father instantly puffed out his chest. His lips curled into a cheap, practiced smile, the kind of smile he used at the local hardware store to get out of paying a late fee. He took a half step forward, extending his right hand to receive the ultimate honor of being the proud father. But Admiral Vance did not slow down. He did not even glance sideways. The thick, dark fabric of his navy overcoat brushed roughly against the sleeve of my father's borrowed suit. The force of the admiral's movement actually spun my father a few inches to the side. To the fleet commander, the older man standing there with his hand hanging in the air was nothing. Just invisible roadkill on the side of a highway. An obstacle that did not warrant a second look. The admiral stopped dead right at the toes of my leather Oxfords. The entire wall of officers trailing behind him slammed their boots together. A deafening crack of military discipline echoing in the marble hall. Vance extended his hand toward me. His face was carved from stone. His voice was deep, carrying the crushing weight of absolute authority. "Commander Knight, we have been waiting for you." I brought my heels together. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence. I reached out and gripped the admiral's hand. It was a bone-crushing squeeze. Equal. A transaction of respect between soldiers who knew the smell of burning diesel and copper blood. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father standing completely paralyzed. His thick, calloused arms still floated aimlessly in empty space. The cheap fabric of his sleeve fluttered in the draft. His jaw hung open, but his throat was locked tight. He stared at the daughter he had just ordered out of the line. The same daughter who now held the attention of the most powerful men in the capital. His delusion was breaking apart piece by piece right on the White House floor. The admiral pivoted on his heel, clearing a path for me to enter the main hall first. The sea of high-ranking officers parted, stepping back to give me room. I took long, calculated steps forward. I kept my back straight. I did not look back. My father had to scramble to catch up. He shrank his shoulders, shuffling behind me like a petty thief sneaking through a back door. The arrogance was entirely drained from his posture. The moment I crossed the threshold into the East Room, the applause hit. Dozens of hands clapping in unison. A thunderous roar of recognition. Every single pair of eyes in that massive room locked onto me. But right at the peak of that glorious noise, the sound began to warp. The sharp clapping stretched out, distorting inside my head. It turned hollow, wooden. The applause faded away, replaced by a violent cracking sound. Thwack! It was the unmistakable dry smack of a wooden bat crushing a baseball. Thwack! Echoing through a foggy autumn afternoon 30 years ago. Back in a cramped living room in Virginia, the exact place where the rot first started. The sharp crack of the baseball bat ripped me straight out of the front row at the White House. It threw me violently backward through time, slamming me down onto the scuffed hardwood floor of a cramped kitchen in Virginia. I was 8 years old. I burst through the front door of the house. I completely ignored the acrid smell of a cheap pot roast burning on the stove. My heavy boots hit the floor hard, tracking in a few dry autumn leaves. In my right hand, I held a spelling test. The red ink at the top of the page spelled out a perfect score. To an 8-year-old kid living in the shadows, that piece of paper was not just a grade. It was a survival medal. It was undeniable proof that I had value. I ran straight into the living room. My father was anchored to his worn-out fabric recliner. His eyes were glued to a Sunday afternoon NFL game, blaring from the heavy television set. I stood at strict attention right beside his armrest. I raised the paper with both hands. I held it out like a foot soldier delivering a critical combat report. "Dad, look, I got a perfect score." He did not take his eyes off the television screen. The quarterback was dropping back for a pass. My father reached out his heavy, calloused hand and blindly snatched the paper from my fingers. He glanced at it. 1 second, 2 seconds. That was it. That 2-second window was the exact market value of my entire existence. "Good job," he muttered. His voice was flat, empty. He did not smile. He did not even look me in the eye. A split second later, he tossed the test onto the edge of the scratched coffee table. It landed right next to a half-empty bottle of cheap domestic beer. A ring of cold condensation soaked into the corner of the paper, immediately blurring the bright red ink of my perfect score. He snapped his head toward the front hallway. Michael just walked in. My older brother was dragging a mud-caked aluminum baseball bat across the beige carpet. The shift in the room was sudden and violent. My father sat up straight. His voice suddenly exploded with life, shaking the thin walls of the house. "There he is! How was practice, son? What did the coach say about your swing?" My father pushed his heavy frame out of the recliner. He rushed to the kitchen to fetch a glass of ice water for Michael. He started talking fast. He broke down sports strategies. He talked about how Michael was going to be the future star of the Knight family name. I looked around the room. The living room walls were a cruel, undeniable map of his investment strategy. The wooden shelves bowed under the weight of cheap plastic Little League baseball trophies. Framed photographs of my brother in various team uniforms dominated every single line of sight. There was no space for anything else. Whenever relatives came over for the holidays, my father would slap Michael on the shoulder, puff out his chest, and announce to the room, "This is the star of the house." Nobody ever asked how my classes were going. Nobody asked what I wanted to be. In the cold, calculating ecosystem of that house, I was just unpaid logistics personnel. I was the ghost who folded the laundry, scrubbed the grease off the frying pans, and stayed out of the way. I stood rooted to the spot next to the coffee table. The roaring crowd from the football game on the television mixed with the loud, booming laughter of the two men in the room. The noise built an invisible, soundproof glass wall around me. I was standing less than 3 feet away from my own flesh and blood, but I was completely isolated. My existence did not register on their radar. My perfect test paper lay there soaking up stale beer. I reached out. My small hand clamped down on the paper. I squeezed my fist tight. The crisp paper crumpled. It flattened into a useless, wrinkled ball in my palm. The rough texture of the crushed paper dug into my skin. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not demand his attention. Children figure out the absolute boundaries of their survival very quickly. I realized right then that crying was a resource I could not afford to waste on people who were never going to look at me. If you have ever been the invisible child in your own home, if you have ever had your greatest achievements thrown in the trash while someone else got all the praise, drop a 100 in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Let me know I am not speaking into the void. I turned my back on the bright living room. I walked straight down the narrow hallway into my bedroom. It was pitch black. The blinds were drawn tight. I closed the door behind me and pushed the brass lock until it clicked. I slid my back down the cheap wood paneling until I hit the freezing floorboards. I sat there in the dark. I pulled my knees to my chest. My spine was perfectly straight against the wall, mimicking a soldier in a trench. I did not shed a single tear. I just sat in the absolute silence, clutching the ruined piece of paper in my fist. I stared into the blackness of the room, understanding for the very first time that in this life, I was entirely on my own. I was 14 years old when the financial dictatorship of my house became completely transparent. Travel baseball. That was the black hole swallowing every single spare dollar my father brought home. The expenses were endless, and they were approved without a single blink. Elite summer camps, custom-ordered cleats, batting cage memberships. I watched my father pull out his credit card to buy Michael a $300 imported leather catcher's mitt. The very next morning, I walked 3 miles down the shoulder of the highway in ankle-deep slush. I found my father sitting on the back porch rubbing expensive linseed oil into Michael's new glove. I stood there shivering in a cheap jacket and asked him for $50. I needed a graphing calculator for my honors math class. He did not even look up from the leather. He just kept rubbing the oil in small, tight circles. "We do not have the budget for that kid," he muttered, his voice flat. "Figure it out yourself." So I figured it out. I tied a grease-stained apron around my waist. I spent my weeknights standing over a steaming clogged sink at a local roadside diner, scrubbing baked-on eggs and charred grease off heavy ceramic plates. The industrial degreaser ate straight through my skin. My knuckles cracked open. My cuticles bled constantly. My fingers went completely numb from the freezing water out back whenever I had to drag the leaking garbage bags to the dumpster in the alley. The physical exhaustion eventually broke my defenses. One Tuesday night, the armor cracked. I lay curled up in a tight ball under a thin quilt in my freezing bedroom. I shoved the back of my hand into my mouth, biting down hard on my own flesh. Biting down until I tasted copper just to keep the violent sobs from leaking through the thin drywall. The door hinges whined. My mother, Sarah, stepped into the dark room. She did not turn on the overhead light. She did not make a fuss. She simply sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. Her thin fingers reached out firmly, pulling my bruised, wet hand away from my teeth. "You are hurting," she said. Her voice was light, barely a whisper, but it cut straight through the bone. I shook my head violently in the dark, denying it. But the tears broke loose anyway, hot and humiliating against my cold cheeks. "He does not care if I live or die," I hissed through my teeth, the venom finally spilling out. My mother stroked my hair. Her hand was warm, grounding me in the dark. Her eyes caught the faint streetlight coming through the window blinds. They were sharp, cold steel. "Sophia," she whispered, leaning in close, "one day you will make them see exactly who you are." That single promise was my oxygen tank. It was the only thing keeping my head above water in that house. But wars do not spare the innocent. When I was 17, cancer invaded. It was fast, and it was brutal. Within 3 months, the house stopped smelling like burnt pot roast and stale beer. It smelled like bleach-soiled linen and the sickly sweet scent of liquid morphine. My father and Michael could not handle the reality of a dying woman. It required sacrifice, and that was not in their playbook. So they ran. They packed their duffel bags, loaded up the truck, and drove out of state for a meaningless regional baseball tournament. They left me entirely alone. I carried the weight. I stood in the damp, freezing basement at 2 a.m, scrubbing blood and stomach acid out of my mother's bedsheets by hand. I sat by her bed in the dark, spooning crushed ice into her mouth while the snow piled up heavy against the bedroom window. One late winter night, the heater was rattling in the corner of the room. She was too weak to even lift her head off the pillow. Her breathing was a shallow, wet rattle inside her chest. She rolled her head slightly, locking her sunken, bruised eyes onto mine. Promise me. She forced the words out, gasping for every single inch of air. Never. Let anyone price your worth. I leaned over the bed rails. I gripped her frail, trembling hand in both of mine. I bit my lower lip until it bled, holding back the panic. I promise. 10 minutes later, the heart monitor beside the bed let out a single piercing, continuous beep. The sharp spike on the glowing green screen flattened into a dead horizontal line. The fragile fingers resting inside my palm went completely still. The warmth started to drain out of her skin, immediately replaced by the creeping chill of the room. There was no one else there, just me and the hum of the baseboard heater. My father was 200 miles away, sitting in some cheap aluminum bleachers, chewing sunflower seeds, and cheering on a son who had just struck out swinging. I stood up. The wooden legs of the chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. I reached down and pulled the thin white hospital blanket up over my mother's face. I did not scream. I did not fall to my knees. My tear ducts were completely dry. In that exact fraction of a second, the last soft, vulnerable piece of my childhood died right there on that mattress. I locked my chest vault shut. I established the highest level of survival protocol. The enemy was no longer hiding behind closed doors or passive-aggressive comments. The battlefield was clear. I turned my back on the bed and walked out of the room. I had a promise to keep, and I needed to find a wooden cedar chest. 3 days after my mother took her last breath, the house was packed. The air was thick, suffocating, smelling of cheap cologne and baked ziti. Relatives I barely knew crowded the living room in their stiff black suits. They held flimsy paper plates heavy with deli-bought potato salad. They mumbled hollow condolences between bites of cold-cut sandwiches, their eyes constantly darting toward the television. I stood in the far corner of the kitchen, my back pressed hard against the humming refrigerator, my arms crossed tight over my chest. I watched my father. He did not shed a single tear at the cemetery. He was not shedding one now. He stood by the front window, slapping an uncle on the shoulder. He was holding a plastic cup of domestic beer, talking loud enough for the whole room to hear. Yeah, Michael's got the regional championship coming up next weekend. Kids swinging a hot bat, scout from a Division II school, might come down to watch. My mother had been in the dirt for less than 24 hours. And my father was already back to managing his precious baseball project. I looked around the crowded room, dozens of people, noise, clinking forks, fake sympathy. But I knew the absolute truth. I was standing in an abandoned house. 1 week after my high school graduation, I walked into the kitchen. I dropped a thick stack of college applications and financial aid forms onto the dining table. The heavy thud made my father look up from his newspaper. He took a slow sip of his black coffee. He looked at the paperwork. He let out a long, calculated sigh. He set the mug down on a coaster. Sophia, let's shoot straight, he said. His voice was smooth, too smooth. The savings account is tapped out. We dropped everything we had left into your brother's summer showcase camp. He tapped his thick, calloused finger against the table. The window for pro ball is opening up for him right now. This house cannot carry your tuition on top of that. College is not mandatory anyway. Get a job at the mall. He delivered the death sentence to my future with the same tone he used to complain about property taxes. It was a completely legal robbery. He stripped my future to the bone to feed the family ego. He expected me to take out tens of thousands in predatory student loans so his son could buy imported cleats. I did not argue. I did not beg. I just stared at his jawline for 3 seconds. Then I quietly reached out, pulled the stack of papers back to my chest, and walked away. That night, I started packing up my mother's bedroom. The air in there still held the faint, sickly smell of industrial bleach and liquid morphine. I pulled open the heavy lid of the old cedar chest at the foot of the bed. The sharp, earthy smell of the wood hit my lungs. I dug past the folded winter blankets and mothballs. Right at the bottom, my fingers brushed against a worn paper envelope. The corner was bent. It smelled faintly of the cheap drugstore perfume she used to wear on Sundays. I tore the seal open. There was no cash inside, no hidden jewelry, just a single piece of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was shaky, thinned out by months of brutal chemotherapy. To Sophia. Never let the opinions of others become your destiny. Build a fortress that no one can ever break down. I stood under the dim overhead light. I ran my thumb over the faded blue ink. I smoothed the paper out flat against the top of the wooden chest. My eyes were completely dry. No tears. Crying was a luxury for victims. What I held in my hand was not a sentimental goodbye note. It was a direct combat order. I did not scream for what was fair. Weak people demand handouts from people who hate them. I went to work. I carpet-bombed every university in the state with scholarship applications. I took the night shift at an Amazon fulfillment center out by the interstate. 12 hours a night on cold concrete floors. The constant high-pitched beeping of barcode scanners drilled into my skull. I hauled heavy cardboard boxes until the muscles in my shoulders felt like torn meat. My steel-toed boots gave me blisters that popped and bled into my cheap socks. I slept 4 hours a day on a deflating air mattress. I used my father's absolute betrayal as raw fuel. Every time my back ached, I pictured his smug face talking about baseball at a funeral. A few months later, I scraped together enough grant money and minimum wage paychecks to cover my first semester. I packed everything I owned into one cheap black canvas suitcase. I zipped it shut. The metal zipper clinked against the floorboards. I dragged it down the hallway. My father was on the couch watching a preseason football game. He heard the cheap plastic wheels rolling over the carpet. He looked back over his shoulder. He did not get up. He gave me a half-hearted, dismissive nod. "Lock the door on your way out," he grunted, turning his attention back to the screen. I did not answer. I walked out into the freezing morning air and pulled the door shut behind me. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a loud metallic snap. He had absolutely no idea. The broken invisible daughter who just walked through that door was dead, and the soldier who replaced her was already marching straight toward the nearest Navy recruitment office. The United States Navy does not care who your father is. They do not care if you were the invisible kid who washed greasy diner plates to survive. They only care if you can clear the barbed wire and keep breathing when the mud fills your nose. I was 20 years old when I pushed through the heavy glass door of the local recruitment office. The recruiter behind the scratched metal desk did not smile. He looked up from his clipboard, his eyes scanning my cheap, worn-out winter jacket. "What are you looking for in here?" he asked, his voice flat and tired. I locked my eyes straight onto his. Something no one can ever take out of my hands. Boot camp was brutal. Great Lakes in the dead of winter, freezing slush up to my chest. The drill instructors screamed until their vocal cords tore, the harsh noise ringing in my frozen ears. My leg muscles cramped into tight knots. My lungs burned like I was breathing in a shattered glass. I slept on a rock-hard mattress, making my bed with corners so sharp they could cut skin. But I loved the absolute cruelty of it. It was fair. Out there in the freezing rain, there was no golden child. There was no favorite son. It was a strict, unforgiving meritocracy built entirely on blood and sweat. You earned your rank, or you washed out. No exceptions. No free rides. The year I pinned on my gold ensign bars, a shockwave hit the house back in Virginia. Michael blew out his shoulder in a meaningless amateur exhibition game. A severe Stage 3 torn rotator cuff. The sickening pop of his tendon was loud enough to be heard from the aluminum bleachers. Just like that, the grand professional baseball dream was dead. Done. Over. Every single dollar, every ounce of pride, the massive inflated ego my father had built around that boy completely shattered. The grand investment turned into absolute garbage overnight. Michael did not bounce back. He refused physical therapy. He sank deep into the worn-out couch cushions, gaining 30 pounds. He started drinking cheap domestic beer at noon, tossing the empty cans onto the carpet. He became a middle-aged burnout with a receding hairline, living rent-free in a house that smelled like stale alcohol and unwashed laundry. For the first time in my life, I heard genuine suffocating panic in my father's voice over the phone. His lifelong project was completely bankrupt. The patriarchal empire he built in that cramped living room was rotting from the inside out. He had bet the entire house on a losing horse. The contrast between us became a bitter, undeniable pill. Right around the time my older brother was passing out on the sofa, with a half-eaten bag of greasy potato chips resting on his gut, I was standing in the middle of a disaster zone. A Category 5 hurricane had just leveled a coastal town in Florida. I was in command of a rapid response team. We waded through toxic, waist-deep floodwater. The air smelled of raw sewage, rotting wood, and leaked gasoline. I dug through the jagged concrete of a collapsed roof, with my bare hands the rough debris scraping the skin off my knuckles. I pulled terrified survivors out of a flooded storm drain, the freezing water soaking right through my tactical gear. The men under my command were huge, hardened combat sailors, guys with thick necks and tattooed forearms. But they followed my orders without a single second of hesitation. They trusted me with their lives because they knew I would never leave them behind. I built my authority with Callus's discipline and shared suffering. My financial accounts were solid, built on strict military savings and smart investments. Meanwhile, my 60-year-old father was picking up overtime shifts at the shipping warehouse, breaking his own aging back on a concrete floor just to keep the electricity on for his deadbeat son. I made the rank of commander, silver oak leaves pinned tight to my collar. I stood in my sterile, perfectly organized office, picked up my phone, and dialed the Virginia area code. I did not make the call looking for his approval. My childhood craving for his validation died a long, long time ago on a cold mattress. This was just a field test. "Dad, I just made commander," I said. My voice was completely flat. I could have been reading him the morning traffic report. The line went dead silent. Only the faint crackling static of a bad long-distance connection filled my ear. He let out a heavy, tired exhale. When he finally spoke, it was the exact same cheap, emotionally bankrupt tone he had used for 38 years. "That is good, kid," he mumbled, clearly distracted. I could hear the television blaring a sports game in the background. "Hey, listen, if you got some extra cash at the end of the month, help your brother out with his utility bill, all right? Guy is having a tough run lately. Needs a little boost." He did not ask if I was safe. He did not ask what the rank meant. He did not care about the silver oak leaves. To them, I was just a walking ATM, a backup generator for their failed, miserable lives. I did not argue. I did not yell. I just pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at the glowing screen for 2 seconds, staring at his contact name. Then I hit the red button. Click. They forgot one fundamental rule of engagement. A commanding officer does not take orders from a loser. Late one Tuesday evening in October, I walked into my sterile apartment. I dropped my keys on the counter. In the stack of mail was a heavy dark leather envelope stamped with the Department of Defense seal. I did not rip it open. I pulled my combat knife from my belt, sliding the cold steel cleanly under the wax seal. Inside was a thick piece of cardstock. Heavy. Expensive. The kind of paper that commands respect before you even read the ink. The presidential seal sat at the very top, shimmering in raised gold foil. It was an official invitation from the White House, the National Award for Exceptional Military Leadership. My hurricane response and disaster relief files from Florida had crossed Admiral Vance's desk. He bypassed the standard chain of command and submitted my name straight to the top. I stood in the quiet kitchen. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. I slowly ran my thumb over the gold-embossed letters spelled out across the center of the card. Commander Sophia Knight. I looked up. Pinned to the corkboard above my desk was a small faded photograph of my mother. I looked into her eyes. "They see exactly who I am now, Mom." I whispered into the empty room. I set the card down. I picked up my phone. I dialed the Virginia area code. When my father answered, I did not sound excited. I delivered the information with the absolute, flat, emotionless tone of a morning briefing. I told him about the award. He grunted, half listening. Then I dropped the location. "The ceremony is at the White House." The shift on the other end of the line was immediate and pathetic. The heavy sigh vanished. The White House. His voice cracked slightly, jumping up an octave. "Like the president." Yes. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head, the raw, naked desperation for status kicking into overdrive. He started stuttering. He cleared his throat twice. He did not ask what I did to earn the medal. He did not ask about the scars on my hands or the nights I spent sleeping in toxic mud. He did not care about the actual blood I bled to get my name on that gold foil. He just wanted the access code. He wanted the Facebook post. He wanted to stand in the East Room, take a blurry photo of a chandelier, and show it off to the guys at the local bar. He wanted to puff out his chest and pretend that his brilliant parenting had produced a White House honoree. Well, Sophia, I could probably get some time off the warehouse floor, if you need someone there with you. A +1. I stared at the blank wall of my kitchen. A cold, hard smirk pulled at the corner of my mouth. The trap was set. Yes, you can come along. A lot of people, especially civilians, ask me why I did it. Why would I ever invite the man who financially and emotionally starved me to share my highest honor? They think it was an act of forgiveness. They think I was being the bigger person. They are completely wrong. Screaming matches in a dirty living room are for weak people. That kind of revenge just gives them the satisfaction of knowing they can still control your heart rate. My revenge was a perfectly engineered psychological operation. I needed to drag him out of his safe, comfortable bubble in Virginia. I needed to pull him away from the Little League trophies and the couch where he played the undisputed king. I wanted to drop him right into the dead center of a world where his blue-collar, patriarchal authority was an absolute joke. I needed him to see it. I needed him to feel the crushing weight of his own insignificance. I wanted him to watch the daughter he threw away become a force of nature that he had to look up to. If you have ever had a toxic parent try to steal the credit for your hard work after ignoring you for years, drop a fake in the comments right now. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe. We all know exactly how that hypocrisy feels, and that cold, calculated plan brings us straight back to the present second, to the West Wing security gate, where the man in the borrowed suit just told me to step out of line because I was not invited. The roaring applause from the military brass inside the East Room shattered my flashback like a hammer through glass. The warped sound of the baseball bat vanished. The reality of the White House rushed back in. Admiral Vance gave a sharp nod. The dense crowd of high-ranking officers parted instantly, creating a wide, unobstructed path. I squared my shoulders. I stepped forward, walking straight into the grand hall. Behind me, the shuffling sound of leather shoes dragging across marble. My father was scrambling to keep up. He was hunched over, trying to make himself as small as physically possible so the Secret Service agents would not stare at him. The arrogant smirk from the security gate was completely gone, replaced by the pale, sweaty panic of a man who realized he had walked onto a battlefield with zero ammunition. The curtain was finally dropping. His precious ego was about to be put on trial, stripped bare under the blinding, unforgiving light of absolute truth. A White House staff member in a sharp, dark suit intercepted us inside the East Room. He checked his clipboard, gave me a stiff nod, and gestured toward the front of the hall. I walked down the center aisle. We bypassed row after row of heavy hitters, 4-star generals, cabinet secretaries, high-ranking intelligence directors, the people who actually ran the country. My father shuffled nervously behind me. The further we walked to the front, the more his spine curled. The crushing weight of the room was pressing him down. He was a guy who liked to throw his weight around at the local hardware store and scream at high school baseball umpires. But in here, surrounded by absolute silent authority, his massive ego was shrinking into nothing. The staff member stopped at the very front row. He extended an open hand, pointing directly to 2 heavy gold-trimmed velvet chairs set right in the center. Reserved seating. My father hit the brakes. He physically recoiled, taking a clumsy half-step backward. He looked around the immediate area, completely disoriented. He rubbed the back of his neck, his voice dropping into a hoarse, confused whisper. "What is this? Did they sit us in the wrong section?" I stopped. I turned around slowly. I locked my eyes directly onto his. I did not blink. I dropped my voice low, grinding out every single syllable with the precision of a sniper lining up a shot. "This is my seat. You are just tagging along." The words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He dropped into the velvet chair like a 100-pound sandbag. His knees gave out. He stared straight ahead at the empty wooden podium. His brain was completely offline. The ceremony kicked off. The low murmur of the crowd died instantly. A booming voice echoed through the high-end PA system, vibrating right against my eardrums. The announcer called my name, Commander Sophia Knight. Then the announcer started reading the official military citation. They did not talk about perfect spelling tests. They did not talk about cheap plastic sports trophies or batting averages. The citation cut straight to the Middle East. It detailed a brutal, bloody ambush in 2018. The announcer's voice stayed dead level as he described how an insurgent mortar shell ripped through our perimeter. He read the official after-action report out loud to the room. He described how I used my own body weight to shield a collapsed field med tent, how a jagged piece of hot shrapnel tore straight through my left shoulder, how I held that compromised position for 14 straight hours, bleeding into the sand, returning suppressive fire until the medevac choppers finally broke through the dust. I sat with my back perfectly straight, my hands resting flat on my knees. Right next to me, I heard the sudden sharp intake of air. My father was hyperventilating. His heavy, wet breaths came in short, jagged gasps. He knew every single detail about the time Michael dislocated a finger sliding into second base. He talked about that injury for a decade. But he had absolutely no idea that his daughter had taken enemy shrapnel to save the lives of 4 Marines. He was drowning in the reality of his own ignorance. The announcer finished the citation. Hundreds of guests in the East Room stood up in perfect unison. A wall of applause exploded through the hall. It was deafening. I stood up. I took long, steady strides up the carpeted steps to the stage. The President of the United States stepped forward. He pinned the heavy silver medal to the left breast of my dress uniform. The medal felt cold and solid against my chest. I turned around to face the crowd. The bright, blinding glare of the follow spot hit my face. My eyes scanned out over the standing ovation, dropping straight down to the front row. For the first time in my 38 years of life, I saw my father cry. He was not just shedding a quiet tear. He had both of his thick, rough hands pressed hard over his face. His broad shoulders shook violently. He was sobbing, a pathetic, broken, gasping sound. But I knew exactly what that was. It was not the proud tears of a loving father. It was the absolute crushing humiliation of a small, arrogant man who just realized he did not know a single thing about the daughter he brought into the world. He had bet against me his entire life, and the receipt was finally being read out loud on national television. I walked down the steps. I took my seat back in the front row. My father did not look up. He kept his head buried, his rough hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles turned dead white. He was trying to stop his hands from shaking. Admiral Vance leaned over from the seat to my left. The applause was still rolling through the room, but his deep voice cut right through the noise, loud enough for just the 2 of us to hear. "Your mother would be incredibly proud of you today, Commander." A sharp, sudden ache hit the dead center of my chest. My armor cracked just for a fraction of a second. I reached up slowly with my right hand. My index finger traced the rough texture of the fabric ribbon attached to the silver medal. The combat order from the bottom of the cedar chest was officially executed. The immediate shock of the ceremony eventually wore off. By the time the formal reception kicked off in the state dining room, my father's natural blue-collar arrogance started creeping back in. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated the floor, pouring expensive red wine into delicate crystal glasses. The sharp clinking of glassware replaced the heavy silence of the medal presentation. My father grabbed a glass of Cabernet from a passing tray. He took a heavy sip, swallowing loudly. His posture began to change. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his borrowed suit. He started edging closer to me, aggressively sliding into my personal space every time a group of high-ranking officers came over to shake my hand. He was running a desperate, pathetic hustle. Every time a captain or a defense attaché offered their congratulations, my father immediately inserted himself into the conversation. He started throwing around the pronoun we. "Yes, we are very proud of her," he told a 2-star Marine general swirling his wine. "We always ran a tight ship at home. Taught her strict discipline early on. You know how it is. You have to be hard on them if you want them to be tough." I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. I did not interrupt him. I did not roll my eyes. I did not call him a liar. I just watched him operate. I let him dig his own grave in the middle of the White House. He was putting on a desperate, desperate show, trying to steal a sliver of the spotlight that he never paid a single cent to build. The crowd shifted. The immediate circle of officers around us naturally parted. Admiral James Vance walked through the gap. The fleet commander was not drinking alcohol. He held a simple glass of iced, sparkling water. The sheer gravity of his presence made the surrounding noise drop to a low hum. My father saw the 4 gold stars on Vance's collar. His eyes lit up like a slot machine, the ultimate target. My father practically shoved a junior officer out of the way. He quickly fumbled, switching his wine glass from his right hand to his left. He wiped his sweating right palm on his suit trousers and aggressively thrust it forward. He leaned his heavy frame in, flashing that same cheap hardware store smile. "Admiral Vance, an absolute honor, sir. I am Richard Knight, Sophia's father. I just wanted to personally thank you for recognizing my girl today. You know, to raise a tough commander like this, we really had to put her through the ringer back home. It takes a strong family to build a strong soldier, right?" The Admiral stopped. He did not take the offered hand. Vance just stood there. He looked down at my father's outstretched, calloused hand hanging suspended in the empty space between them. Then Vance slowly raised his eyes. The Admiral's stare was completely dead. Cold, dark water. The temperature in our immediate circle dropped 10 degrees. The surrounding officers went dead silent, their eyes locking onto the train wreck happening right in front of them. "Mr. Knight," the Admiral said. His voice was low. He pronounced every single syllable with the sharp, clinical precision of a surgeon cutting through dead tissue. "I signed off on the security clearance for this commander. I have personally reviewed every single page of her medical, financial, and psychological files from the exact day she stepped into the recruitment office as a 20-year-old. Vance took a deliberate half-step forward. The physical intrusion forced my father to stumble backward on the thick wool carpet just to keep his balance. His hand slowly dropped to his side. "I know exactly how she paid for her college tuition." Vance continued, his voice dropping another notch. "I know how she scrubbed floors and hauled boxes to keep herself from starving. I know that she recovered from combat injuries alone. I know that she pulled herself out of the mud and into the command ranks of the United States Navy without a single dollar of financial aid and without a single day of family visitation leave." My father's jaw went completely slack. The color drained out of his face, leaving a sickly pale gray behind. He stopped breathing. Admiral Vance did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He just drove the final nail directly into the coffin. "Commander Knight is not great because of her family. She's great in spite of you. The United States Navy is her family." The silence that followed was suffocating. It was heavier than a physical blow. The absolute brutal truth hit my father right between the eyes. The pathetic mask of the proud, disciplined patriarch shattered into a million jagged pieces, scattering across the expensive White House carpet. The military officers standing within earshot physically turned their backs on my father. It was a synchronized, unspoken movement of absolute disgust. They completely iced him out. My father stood frozen, his mouth hung open, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry concrete. His hands were shaking violently. The dark red wine sloshed over the rim of his crystal glass, splashing a dark wet stain right down the sleeve of his borrowed jacket. He could not look at the Admiral. He could not look at the officers, and he absolutely could not look at me. He took 3 fast, clumsy steps backward. He bumped hard into a passing waiter, ignoring the clatter of silverware. He turned his back and power-walked toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. He looked exactly like a cornered rat fleeing a burning building. His head was tucked down into his shoulders, trying to disappear into the crowd. I stood there for 3 seconds. I picked up my half-empty glass of dry champagne from a high-top table. I took 1 slow sip. I set the crystal flute back down the glass, making a sharp final clink against the polished wood. I adjusted the cuffs of my uniform. Then I turned and followed his path out of the room at a slow, calculated pace. It was time to end this. I stepped out through the heavy glass doors of the south portico. The sudden drop in temperature hit my face like a physical wall. The October wind in Washington was sharp and freezing. It carried the faint smell of wet asphalt and Potomac River dampness. I left the noise of the state dining room far behind me. The clinking crystal glasses and loud political chatter faded into a dull, distant hum. I walked down the paved pathway toward the south lawn. The dim yellow light from the security lamps cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the manicured grass. I found him exactly where I expected him to be. My father was sitting alone on a cold granite bench. He was hunched over. Both of his thick, calloused hands were pressed hard against the sides of his head, his rough fingers digging into his thinning hair. His elbows rested heavily on his knees. The dark red wine stain on the sleeve of his borrowed suit jacket looked almost black under the yellow street lamp. His body was curled inward. He looked incredibly small. He looked pathetic. The loud, aggressive patriarch who used to terrorize our cramped Virginia living room was completely gone. The illusion of his blue-collar authority had been burned to the ground. My leather Oxfords crunched loudly against the loose gravel. He heard my footsteps approaching. He slowly lifted his head. His face was deeply lined and aged. His eyes were bloodshot, swollen, and completely empty. He looked up at me. His gaze dropped immediately to the heavy silver medal pinned to my uniform. The medal caught the faint yellow light, shining sharply in the dark. Then his eyes slowly moved up to meet mine. My face was carved from stone. I did not offer a single ounce of warmth. I did not offer a lifeline. He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. The last remaining wall of his defensive pride finally crumbled into dust. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly whisper. It broke apart in the freezing wind. He coughed a dry, rattling sound that shook his heavy chest. I did not step closer to comfort him. I stopped exactly 3 feet away. I slid my boots shoulder-width apart. I clasped both of my hands firmly behind my back. Parade rest. I stood perfectly straight and waited for his official surrender. He wiped the back of his rough hand across his wet nose. I always thought the boy was the pillar of the house. I thought a man needed a strong son to carry the family name. I poured every single dollar, every drop of my energy into Michael. I was so blinded by my own stupid project. I completely missed seeing what was right in front of me. I missed seeing the giant you grew up to become. He took a deep, jagged breath. A cloud of white mist plumed from his mouth into the freezing night air. I remember it, he whispered, his voice cracking. I remember that spelling test from the 3rd grade. I saw the red ink. I saw the perfect score. I knew exactly how smart you were. I knew how hard you worked for it. But my damn pride, my arrogance just did not allow me to look at you and admit it. I could not give you an inch. I stood there in the dark. The freezing wind bit through the heavy wool of my uniform, but I did not shiver. I just listened to the words. 30 years ago, an 8-year-old girl standing in a grease-stained kitchen would have traded her own lungs to hear that exact confession. She would have fallen to her knees, cried, and buried her face in his chest. But that little girl was gone. She died a long time ago, sitting alone on a cheap mattress next to a flatlining heart monitor. Now his tearful apology registered in my brain like a weather report from a decade ago. It was factual, but it was completely irrelevant. It held absolutely no power over me anymore. He wiped his eyes again, smearing the tears across his wrinkled cheeks. I know Michael's dream was garbage. I know he is a failure. And I know I ruined our family with my own 2 hands. I cannot buy back those lost years, Sophia. I cannot undo the damage. He looked up at me. It was the desperate, pleading look of a man drowning in the middle of the ocean, begging for a piece of driftwood. But can we try to move forward, together? Can you let me try to be a father to you now? The cold air between us froze completely solid. I looked down at the broken man, waiting for my final judgment. I had the absolute power to destroy him right there. I could scream in his face. I could list every single greasy plate I washed at the diner. I could list every winter night I slept in a freezing apartment while he bought his Golden Sun imported baseball gear. I could turn my back on him, walk out of the White House gates, and sever contact with him for the rest of my natural life. But a good combat commander knows exactly when the war is over. You do not waste live ammunition on an enemy that has already dropped their weapon and fallen to their knees. Driving a knife into a defeated man only proves that you are still controlled by the old wounds he gave you. I refuse to give him that power. I refuse to let his past mistakes dictate my blood pressure for another 30 years. I did not need his validation anymore. Forgiveness in this moment was not an act of emotional weakness. It was an act of absolute, untouchable superiority. Cutting the heavy chains of the past was my final, ultimate liberation. I looked straight into his red, pleading eyes. A faint, freezing smile touched the corners of my mouth. My voice was calm, carrying the quiet, undeniable authority of a victor. Yes, Dad. The flight back to Virginia was dead silent. My father did not order a drink. He did not try to chat with the flight attendant. He just stared out the scratched acrylic window at the clouds. The heavy reality of his own ignorance had finally crushed the oxygen right out of his lungs. 6 months passed. My phone buzzed on a Tuesday afternoon. It was him. He did not demand anything. He asked, his voice hesitant, if I would drive out to the cemetery with him. The air that afternoon was heavy. It smelled of damp earth and crushed wet leaves. We stood side by side in front of her cold granite headstone. An old, massive oak tree cast long shadows over the manicured grass. My father was holding a small bundle of white carnations wrapped in cheap cellophane. He set them down near the base of the stone. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his faded, grease-stained Carhartt work jacket. He pulled out the thick, embossed White House ceremony program. The edges were frayed. The paper was worn down from the sweat of his hands. He had been carrying it around with him every single day. He crouched down. His bad knees popped loudly in the quiet graveyard. He carefully placed the thick cardstock flat against the cold stone right beneath my mother's engraved name. The dry oak leaves rustled loudly in the biting wind. He kept his eyes locked on the dirt. "You were right, Sarah," he whispered. His voice was completely hollow, defeated. "I should have listened to you from the very start. You saw the exact future, and I was completely blind to it." He did not look at me for validation. He just touched the top of the cold headstone and slowly pushed himself back up to his feet. 1 year later, the family gathered in Virginia for a late summer cookout. The house was completely different. The map of his old war was gone. The cheap plastic Little League trophies had been cleared out, dumped into cardboard boxes in the garage. The endless framed photographs of baseball swings were stripped off the walls. Michael was standing at the kitchen sink scrubbing a greasy cast iron grill pan with a steel wool pad. He looked older. He had lost some of the beer weight working a standard 40-hour-a-week desk job at a local insurance firm. He was just a regular guy washing dishes, and he looked perfectly fine with it. Out in the backyard, kids were running through a cheap plastic sprinkler, screaming and laughing in the thick afternoon humidity. The smell of burning charcoal and cheap hot dogs drifted through the screen door. It was peaceful. An absolute, secure peace. My father walked out onto the wooden back deck. He carried 2 bottles of cold domestic beer. He handed one to me. I took it, feeling the condensation drip down the glass. We leaned our elbows against the wooden railing, watching the kids kick up mud in the grass. He did not puff out his chest. He did not try to dominate the conversation with loud sports trivia. He just peeled the damp paper label off the neck of his beer bottle with his thick thumb. I used to think success was shiny gold trophies sitting on a living room shelf. He muttered, his eyes tracking a kid running across the lawn. I was dead wrong. Success is exactly this. He turned and looked at me. His eyes were completely subdued. The loud, overbearing patriarch was gone. The toxic empire he built in that house had burned to the ground, replaced by a flat, undeniable respect for the new chain of command. Most people get the definition of revenge completely wrong. They think payback means taking a sledgehammer to the people who broke you. They think it means screaming until your vocal cords tear and ripping their lives down to the studs. But when you have survived actual combat, when you have patched bullet holes in the desert dirt, your perspective shifts entirely. Standing in the East Room of the White House was not the real victory. The silver medal pinned to my uniform was not the real victory. True victory is walking completely untouched through a childhood minefield of rejection. It is refusing to let your own soul rot out from carrying their toxic hate in your chest. It is having the raw, brutal discipline to build an empire with your bare hands, forcing your enemies to their knees, and then having the absolute power to look down at them and forgive them. My mother's old cedar chest sits in the corner of my living room now. It still smells faintly of dry wood and cheap drugstore perfume. That single piece of lined notebook paper she wrote on is laminated. It sits dead center on my heavy mahogany desk. A permanent combat directive. If you are listening to this right now, pay close attention. If you are a soldier bleeding out on your own front porch because the people who were supposed to protect you threw you to the wolves. If they starved you of money, ripped away your opportunities, and told you that you were worthless because you did not fit their specific agenda. Lock this order into your brain right now. Do not ever let the opinions of small broken people become your permanent destiny. You have two choices in this life. You can roll over and surrender to the narrative they wrote for you. Or you can pick up a shovel, mix the concrete, and build a fortress so incredibly blinding that fate itself has absolutely no choice but to bow down to you. If you are ready to stop being a victim, drop the word fortress in the comments below right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and start your own war today.